Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Westdale Film Talk series, Movies That Mattered. And your reward for coming out on such an ugly, rainy November night is a 20-foot-tall Marlon Brando looking down on you this evening. So glad to be here. I'm filling in for the role of Mr. Fred Fuchs. I'm sure many of you come out for this. You're wondering, where's Fred? What's this guy doing up there? Well, Fred is in California celebrating the Thanksgiving holiday with his family. So Fred gets a night off. I just heard some booing. But my name is Jeff Bender. I am, for those of you that come to the International Film Series or the World Cinema Masterwork Series, I have the great pleasure of programming and hosting that on some Sunday evenings. And I hope you'll come out and see Ingmar Bergman's Fanny and Alexander in December if you've got nothing planned on the 12th. Of course, tonight, it's my great pleasure, as Fred had asked me, to introduce On the Waterfront, 1954's masterpiece by Elia Kazan. And I was thinking to myself, I was so excited to be asked to introduce this until, of course, I've seen it many times, until, of course, I realized, holy mackerel, there's a lot to unpack in this movie. So I don't know how many people are coming to this film for the first time, or perhaps, you've seen it numerous times, but there is an awful lot to talk about with this particular film. Of course, obviously, it's starring the incomparable Marlon Brando as boxer turned longshoreman Terry Malloy, and he's a guy who is totally caught in the middle of the corruption of the docks and the dock works, and of course the waterfront, and of course he's also in the midst of falling in love with this wonderful woman who's portrayed by Eva Marie Saint, and all the while trying to figure out his own journey to redemption, to right the wrongs that he's been involved in over the course of the film. I won't give anything else away. But before we do turn down the lights, I would like to take a quick moment, since this is the Movies That Mattered, to give a little historical context within which this film was made in its early beginnings. When one looks at the waterfront and longshoremen and stevedores in New York and New Jersey, and forgive me, I don't know much about the Hamilton background with the dock works or what have you, so if there's anyone in the audience for after the screening that does have friends or family or a personal insight, I'd love to hear what that experience is like. But in the 1800s, during the great Irish mass of immigration in the United States, there was this incredible backlash of bigotry against the Irish. And so as they were looking for ways to survive in New York in the late 1800s, one of the things that was an open opportunity and was, of course, steered by a fairly corrupt man named Boss Tweed of Tammany Hall. If anyone's seen Gangs of New York, the Scorsese film, he's featured in that particular film. But this man had found a basic monopoly on allowing the dock works to be run by Irish immigrants. And this is something, of course, they were good at it. They came from a country that had many port cities, and they knew what they were doing. Certainly the mercantile industry is something that they really knew an awful lot about. And myself being descended of some family that came over from Ireland to escape the potato famine, of course, I also had relatives that worked in this industry in Eastern Canada. Knows that this was something that they really took quite well to. Of course, as is all things that are not under a certain element of control by the country or the government, there was a seed of corruption that it's a line all the way from the 1870s up until the time that this movie is being told and beyond within this particular niche of American culture. And this is the sort of element of corruption that occurs within the dock works. So over the years, there was an awful lot of secrets about what goes on in the dock works in New York and New Jersey. It was sort of an hands-off kind of industry, and that's because it had this mob control since the 1800s and had been passed down from one to the next. But there was this one particular person of interest in the 1920s, early 20th century named Bill McCormick, who basically ran everything going on in the ports in the eastern districts. And as a result, he became so powerful and had such an integral network of people working for him that he could, at the drop of a hat, stop production and movement of goods and services throughout the country. And as a result, he was also able to control many, many things within the labor unions around the dock workers. A few things that you'll see, of course, I'll talk about them in a moment. You'll actually see evidence of it in the film. But about 1947, 48, 49, there was a journalist named Malcolm Johnson, and he wrote a series of Pulitzer Prize-winning articles to shine some light on the corruption that was occurring in the docks and the labor unions of the waterfront. What he found, first of all, in working with people locally, nobody would talk to him. Very few people would say anything about what was going on, because it was the kind of culture that if you didn't see anything, you didn't hear anything, and you certainly didn't say anything. And you'll see this as evidenced in this particular, in a few scenes in the film. But his expose called "Crime on the Waterfront," you can find it online. It's very well done. He found and was able to find this one particular fellow named Father John Corridon, who was a Jesuit priest. And Corridon had been doing an awful lot of work with individuals in Hoboken and the western part of, the west side of New York, and had uncovered a fair amount of the corruption that we see here. Oddly enough, though, at this time, organized crime in the United States, talking late 40s, had been one of the greatest oversights of law enforcement, and really a blind spot in the powerful FBI led by J. Edgar Hoover. Time and time again, Hoover had opportunities to really put a lot of resources on the organized crime, but he always turned away and submitted those resources to other things, like, for instance, finding communists in the United States during the 1940s and 50s. So it does beg the question, if one were to speculate, what did the mob have on J. Edgar Hoover? But this beat reporter, who, as I mentioned, was one of the very few for local reporting that would win a Pulitzer Prize, Malcolm Johnson, was highly influential in getting the story out to all of people in North America. People were rather shocked by what they were finding out. In people's minds, what's the waterfront? It's where all our bananas and our clothing and our booze comes from other places. You know, other than that, what do I really know about the docks? Nothing at all. And I'm not terribly interested to know much about it until these articles came about. Now, this beat reporter, as I mentioned, we've got J. Edgar Hoover, the most powerful law enforcement agent in the United States. But we've got this beat reporter who's able to find and do so much investigative reporting on the structure of the mafia in the waterfront, with the help of this priest, because the priest knew everything. He found everything out. He talked to everybody, and people trusted him. They lent their ear to him. And so he was very happy to shed much of the light on what was going on. Now, Father John Corridon, also known as the waterfront priest, who Carl Malden's character you'll see in the movie is directly based on, ended up having an incredible influence on ensuring that there was some oversight. And this all came through the voice of Malcolm Johnson, finally. But what's interesting to me is that though Hoover couldn't tie the links of your organized crime, this beat reporter, Malcolm Johnson, could. He was able to tie Bill, the organization or the syndicate, back to Meyer Lansky and Albert Anastasia and their strong involvements in the waterfront at this time. And if anyone's wondering who's Albert Anastasia, there's a very famous image of him in a barber's chair at the Waldorf Astoria after he'd been gunned down. A very expensive haircut for Anastasia. Now, though through Corydon, Johnson was able to educate readers about several unethical practices, from hiring methods to laundering to the murder of dock workers if they were out of line. In the film, what you're going to see are many examples of this that appear, including the rules of what they called shaping up. Does anyone know what shaping up is? Well, you'll see it. It's a very inhumane practice that they had. And this is when longshoremen were expected to show up daily, pay their fees in advance to be allowed to work. You never knew whether or not you were feeding your family from one week to the other. And some of these guys did this for decades. This was just their culture, their way of life, and they never questioned anything. And if you did question, of course, you could find yourself floating in the Hudson River. In addition, on that point, there was very little oversight for workplace safety. And so when accidents occurred, there was next to no accountability. And so the code of conduct, which is referred to in the film as D&D, or deaf and dumb, was the rule of the day. And let's not forget that in the New York and New Jersey region, that the ports and trading had an economic impact to in excess of 500,000 citizens in the 40s and 50s. Hence the reason for how this was able to function so successfully for so many decades, simply ruled by fear. Now, on a side note, because of Johnson's articles, it initiated a national conversation on the existence of organized crime, which led to the formation of the United States Senate Special Committee to investigate crime in interstate commerce. I know everyone came out to see On the Waterfront. This is exciting stuff to talk about, these Senate-led investigation committees, but it was dramatized in Godfather 2 by Coppola. And the reason why this is important is it's one of the very first organized hearings to hear the voices of subpoenaed dock workers to try to understand, where's this corruption coming from? What's this organized crime all about? And of course, throughout the 50s, there would become much more traction around getting the spotlight on this. So unfortunately, as we all are aware, those of us that have watched the news and read a fair amount about this period, we know that not a lot changed all through the 60s, 70s, and the 1980s, that there was still very much this power dynamic that exists. So enter the theater and film director Elia Kazan and screenwriter Bud Schulberg. Now, I've got a lot to say about these guys, but I'm not going to say everything now. I know you want to get to the movie. But Kazan, you could say, was the embodiment of the American dream. Let's see if we can find him here. He's on the left side, obviously. He was born in Istanbul to Greek parents. They were emigrated to the United States in the early part of the 20th century. His father deemed working class, and Elia would attend prestigious schools, including Yale, and join the group theater, etc. But he founded the Actors Studio in the 1940s, and his idea was based on the Stanislavski method of acting. Does anyone know what that is? Just hands up. I see a few hands. In which really trying to pull the emotional memories of his actors out. And his whole purpose behind doing this, of course, was to ensure that he was creating what he called almost a farm to be able to have his own product to utilize in telling stories. So it tells you a little bit about his perspective on actors, but he was very, very kind, very nurturing, and very supportive of building actors. Through his work over the years, I'm sure most of you are probably aware of this if you're classic film lovers, but he became one of the finest directors in the history of Broadway, directing great works of playwrights like Arthur Miller and The Death of the Salesman, Tennessee Williams' Streetcar Named Desire, and of course, which he would later adapt to the screen with Brando. But the reason I'm bringing Kazan up here is that at this time in history, the story of the labor unions and the waterfront had really captured the imagination of the entire nation. People were really interested in, of course, when there's an interest, that means producers are interested in telling stories. He, at the same time, had also had a contemporary named Bud Schulberg, who was the son of a Paramount mogul, Bud was a type of guy who didn't like Hollywood. He wrote a scathing story about it called Run, Sammy, Run, which I highly recommend, very well written. But both were working on projects entirely about the waterfront. Where Schulberg's a little different is that he actually spent time with Father Corridon that I'd mentioned, and he also spent a fair amount of time hanging out in the bars and the seedy areas of Hoboken, New Jersey. And so he was really trying to understand what is the story here and how can I relate it so that it's something relevant. If we go to the mid-1950s, early 1950s, we're looking at stories that are pretty glossy Hollywood stories. What these guys were interested in doing, not unlike what was going on in Italy during the neorealism period, is let's start telling real stories about real people in a very realistic setting. And so these guys formed a relationship, became good friends, and they had a lot in common. And of course, Schulberg's screenplay, which you'll see on the screen here in a moment, which is quite faithfully adhered to despite the impulse to do a lot of improvisation by the actors, is very much intact. But these guys are really trying to understand what is the story and how can we shine some light on the plight of these dock workers, these working men? How can we help in this respect? I might also mention, to help this aspect of realism, that many of the marginal characters and most of the extras that you'll see in this were non-professional actors, some actual longshoremen. You'll see there's a young boy who befriends Brando's Malloy here, Thomas Hanley, whose father in life had actually been killed for saying too much, and he himself would become a longshoreman at the age of 16 and for the rest of his life. So they really focused on utilizing real locations, and finally, I mean, they focused on also filming during this harsh winter, and in New Jersey. It was the coldest winter at that particular date that had ever been on record. So the gritty sense of realism that you guys are going to encounter on the screen tonight, from the docks to the rooftops to the tenement houses, with, of course, Manhattan and the Empire State Building looming far away in the background, really brings this documentary style atmosphere to the film that wasn't normal for avid Hollywood film audiences at the time. You feel like you get some sense of what a day in the life of some of these workers was, and so, as pointed out, is that by one of the workers that consulted, was that you really learn to either put up or shut up. And of course, Kazan felt that the actors got a sense of that, being, forced to go out and work in the cold every single day. To talk a little bit before we wrap up here and put the screen on here, really, what is the reason that we're screening on the Waterfront? Why is this a movie that matters? It's essentially about workers that are being held down, that really haven't any power or the ability to speak for themselves. They were certainly always feeling like they were under the threat of their bosses, and so when you think about the power dynamic that occurs in many kinds of work, and whether or not workers have an opportunity or an ability to speak up or to say whether or not they're in peril or whether their working conditions are fine, it's an interesting topic to consider for after our screening. I should also like to point out that it's also very much about redemption, and for anybody that has done the wrong thing in their life, is there a place for redemption? And we're going to find out as we look at the story of Terry Malloy here. So on that point, when we come back, I'd love to be able to hear your impressions of the film, scenes that spoke to you. If there are any folks that have personal stories about longshoremen out there, feel free to let us know what your experience was like. But also the final thing, and what I'll just very briefly mention, is Brando. And I'd just love for you to have a look at Brando's acting style here today, and love to talk to you a little bit about some of these incredible performances after the screening. So with that said, I hope you'll enjoy the screening of On the Waterfront, and we'll join you when we all come back. Thank you very much, everyone. In elementary school, I had a teacher, I think in grade 5, when we were acting up, she would say, I could have been someone. I could have been a contender, and then just look at the sky. I never knew what she was talking about. But Well, what a movie. You know, if you think about Ava Marie Saint and her role in this movie, and consider for a moment a couple of things. One, Sam Spiegel, the producer of this film, really put pressure on Kazan to minimize the love story. He thought it was dragging the movie down. He thought it was ruining the pace. And yet, if you can imagine, would Terry Malloy's character be as sympathetic without her wonderful character of Edie Doyle? I really don't think so. In my mind, she's the one that's helping Terry move closer towards redemption, and she's the one that's the spurring of that aspect. Without that, I don't know where the movie would be. I mean, it could be just a documentary, essentially, about corruption in the waterfront. Also, oddly enough, when they were making this film, and Spiegel was kind of an interesting character. He went on to also produce Lawrence of Arabia. He had a fantastic track record, but he had originally agreed with a gentleman's handshake with Frank Sinatra to cast Sinatra in the role of Terry Malloy, Sinatra being a Hoboken town boy, right? And when, of course, it was Kazan that was really pushing for Brando. They had worked together. They were quite comfortable with one another. And of course, they figured they'd get more funding if they could get Brando to be in the role. But if you know the movie, incredible success. It was nominated for 12 Academy Awards. It won 8, including Best Picture, the award to the director Kazan, Bud Schulberg for screenwriting, and Boris Kaufman, the cinematographer, and of course Marlon Brando and his acting award, and Eva Marie Saint. Oddly enough, the 3 principal supporting actors I think they split their votes apart from one another. That's Lee J. Cobb as Johnny Friendly, and many of you may remember him as one of the jurors in 12 Angry Men. And Rod Steiger as Charlie, of course, eventually would win his acting award in The Heat of the Night. And finally, Carl Malden, who was in kind of a rather larger than life role as the father. And these guys, all of these folks coming from the Actors Studio, and of course Brando coming from the Stella Adler School of Acting, all method actors, all of them really finding their way into their characters. Although famously, Brando, if you recall, in the scene in the park where he really first spends time with Edie, and she drops her glove on the ground and he picks it up and he's playing with the glove. This is typical method acting, finding something and being able to find your way in emotionally, utilizing props or anything that happens to be somewhat tied to either your own character or others that you're interacting with. You may famously remember Marlon Brando in The Godfather, for those of you that have seen that movie, where he's playing with a cat at the very beginning of the film. He just found a cat on the set, picked it up and brought it onto the set with him and played with this cat. But this is typical classic Brando, finding something to do a little bit of business with. And as you see, what's interesting about that scene and what it tells you about him and about Edie is it's his way of finding maybe he's crossing the line because it's, her property, but it's his way of intimating that he's looking for something at least a little more than just a walk home, ultimately. And I just find that there are so many wonderful moments between these two, and to me, this is what really finds the emotional pathway into the film, particularly when they're talking about his life philosophies and her own life philosophies at the bar, at the saloon. There's some beautiful moments when Terry really can't help her. There's nothing he can do to help her about trying to pursue who murdered her brother. and yet he wants to. Every core of his body wants to do something for this person, but it's all in the face of Brando and his inability to act. And this is the to me, the core of this film is this guy who's constantly being bossed around and being manipulated and owned by Johnny Friendly and his goons, and including the complicity of his brother Charlie, that eventually he can have his own voice and find the courage to be able to speak up. Of course, he's not doing that alone. He also has the help of the father, played by Carl Malden, who, such a method actor, actually wore the overcoat of the Jesuit priest, Father Cordigan, that I mentioned earlier. And so they were close in when they were filming this together. I did want to talk about this very famous scene. If you've never seen On the Waterfront, you're probably aware of this scene, and I find the incredible. Hollywood has these stories over and over again where things just aren't working out, and yet what they can turn into something that really, in the perspectives and the perceptions of those working on the film, could be calamitous. And so this is a pivot point for Terry, right? He realizes what's going on with his brother. He realizes the fact that he's going to get deeper and deeper into this sort of syndicate that exists, this monster and machine that just no one can turn around. So it's a very, very pivotal scene. Kazan was expecting that he would, of course, it's one, by the way, I might mention one of the very few scenes that's done on a studio, on a lot. But when Kazan appears for the filming, he was rather aghast at the fact that all they had was a shell of a vehicle. They thought they would have a front seat where the cab driver would sit, and basically something resembling a taxi cab. They also intended to have a rear projection. For those of you that are wondering what rear projection is, it's when in the old movies you watch and you can see trees going by, traffic going by, where they would shoot stock footage on a screen behind the principal filming. Well, that wasn't there either. Sam Spiegel had really cheaped out on the filming, and so they have this taxi, which behind Steiger and Brando, you would normally see traffic lights coming and going and the cityscape. Of course, they have nothing but a studio wall, and so Kazan is saying, "Well, what in the hell are we going to do with this screening or this shooting?" And getting very, very upset with Spiegel, very animated, and Spiegel said, "Well, you know what? You're brilliant. You'll figure it out." One of the crew members comes to him and says, "I came to the set today on a cab that had Venetian blinds in the back window." He said, "Get me some Venetian blinds." I've never been in a cab that's had Venetian blinds, but whatever. But as a result, Kaufman, the cinematographer, who was brilliant, said, "Well, we'll do this in a way, since we don't have the rear projection, I will set up the lighting in a way that'll look like headlights are coming by them every couple of minutes, and we'll darken the lighting a little bit, and as a result, these guys are packed in like sardines in this very tense scene, and it's an extraordinary scene." I don't know what anyone else thought of it, but I've seen this movie so many times, and I'm sitting in this theater watching it on a big screen for the first time tonight, by the way. And I got to tell you, the choices that Marlon Brando and Rod Steiger make in this scene, by the way, adhering to Schulberg's script very, very closely, no improvisation. I mean, you look at movies up to this point, and the point where Steiger sticks the gun in his brother's stomach really was hard for Brando to figure out, what do I do about this? So, he was having a hard time finding his way in, and Kazan just said, "You just play with it, improvise that piece, find your way." And so rather than slugging him or pushing him back or whatever, it's this oddly gentle moment where he simply takes his brother's hand and moves the gun away very incidentally. And I don't know, it's just an incredibly heartbreaking scene where you realize that Terry is truly alone in this world. And now Steiger could have, of course, responded in a rather abrasive manner himself, and he realizes, of course, his goose is cooked. There's nothing he can do. And I'm sure at this point he's recognizing, I've got to let my brother go. So I just I'm very fond of this scene, as so many people are. It certainly had an influence on pop culture, obviously, and of course, I can say that this movie, including the works of Kazan, influenced people like Sidney Lumet and Martin Scorsese. Scorsese even uses lines from this scene in his masterpiece Raging Bull, in which another boxer portrayed by Robert De Niro as Jake LaMotta is about to go on and do his nightclub act as Terry Malloy. It's very strange, but very, very affecting. Last point, too, on Kazan. What makes this movie, and I purposefully didn't bring up much of Kazan's background in so much of what his affiliations with the Communist Party are. I'm sure many of you know, or you've heard Fred talk about, because he's actually screened quite a few of Kazan's movies, like Gentleman's Agreement a few weeks ago. But Kazan was part of the Communist Party for a couple of years in the mid-'30s when he joined the group theater. And he, of course, had a falling out with them, wasn't interested in the way that they conducted themselves. What he was really shooting for was he wanted to join a political party that was about equality, that entirely had nothing to do with bigotry. And so he thought this was his way in because everyone was welcomed. He didn't like being controlled. He certainly didn't like being told how to communicate, what to do, and particularly when it came to his creative life. And that's precisely what the party was trying to do. So he was ousted ultimately, as was Bud Schulberg, the writer. They were both members of the Communist Party. And so, of course, as I'm sure many of you are aware, when the Red Scare occurred in the late 40s into the 50s, the House of Un-American Activities Committee were hunting for communists, and as I mentioned earlier, J. Edgar Hoover was putting a lot of resources into finding this, not so much into organized crime. But one of the sad moments of Hollywood history is that so many people were brought in front of these subcommittees to basically name and ferret out other communists. And Kazan was no different. He was, in fact, probably the most notorious member that was considered a friendly witness. He resisted at first, really didn't have too much to do with it, but I think he was beginning to see what was at stake for him. Now, what's peculiar, and there are many others that name names, but there are also others that didn't, like Dalton Trumbo, for instance, famously. The thing about Kazan that's a little bit different is that, number one, he had this incredible Broadway career. So, I mean, he really could have spent or could have gone back to working to some extent in Broadway. But the other aspect is that Kazan loved democracy. He loved, he felt he was incredibly lucky living in the United States and being allowed to be a citizen of the U.S. And he felt that communism was a horrible thing and that it was a scary thing. And he was rather bombastic about the fact that he named names. A couple of days later, after he named 8 names, first of all, he always rationalized that those people had already been named, so it wasn't a big deal. They were already out there. One of them was the famous playwright Clifford Odets. All these people were from the group theater, by the way, people he knew, spent time with. And when he named names, a couple of days later, he put an article in the New York Times justifying why he did so. So nobody else did this kind of thing. They instead chose to keep things quiet. Fast forward to the early 1950s. So right after he testified in 52, started making On the Waterfront. As you can tell in the themes of this movie, there is a lot to be said about naming names and saying things and justifying that it's the right thing to do, is to stand up and name names. In the case of Terry Malloy, it's very black and white. He's, obviously a lot of horrible things are happening, and he's gone through an awful lot and lost a lot, as have so many of his colleagues on the Waterfront. We know Johnny Friendly is not a good guy, but what's a bit more ambiguous when it comes to Kazan's career is that those that he named, had he not named those names, yes, he might have harmed his own career, but he also harmed the careers of many others that didn't work for, a decade at least. And there are other names that you can think of. I don't know if anyone knows the actress Lee Grant or Zero Mostel. Gosh, you guys could shout them out. They're not coming to my mind right away. But I mean, there are a lot of people that had their careers harmed. And so when in the 1950s, when this came out, there were a lot of folks that were really not terribly impressed by the message that Kazan was trying to place out here, particularly when Terry Malloy yells at Johnny Friendly, says, I'm glad at what I've done to you. Paraphrasing. But that was in the mind of people in Hollywood were thinking, this is Kazan directing his furor at any of his critics. So it's at the time, it's a bit controversial, this film. Schulberg, on the other hand, had no interest in dredging up any friendly witness stuff he was doing. He was not interested in going that route. What he was truly interested in, and had made many friends in Hoboken and really became very, very interested in the cause of the working class. He wanted their voice to be heard. He wanted their stories to be told. And his hope was, with the medium of film, not just thousands of people, but millions of people would be able to understand that this is a real problem. And of course, throughout his life, they both lived very old lives. Schulberg certainly got behind people and who had a story to tell. And of course, what I find, the thing about art, people can sort of shrug their shoulders and look at Kazan. In 1999, he was given an honorary Lifetime Achievement Award at the Oscars, and people didn't stand, they didn't applaud him. And I think that's the right of people to not do that. But it's always that big question of separating the art from the artist. And Kazan's gone, Schulberg's gone. Most of these people, except for Eva Marie Saint, they're gone. And yet the movie survives, and the stories of the film survive. And are those stories still relevant today? So just a little bit of trivia to share with you, a little bit about behind the scenes of what Kazan was about. And he did go on to make more movies. He actually had quite a prolific career beyond On the Waterfront. Those are just a highlight of some of the most notable movies that he made. And I certainly urge you to look into them. They're excellent. I mean, they're incredible because he knew about people. He knew about the human spirit. And that's truly what he ultimately wanted to focus on. So I've talked more than I really should have. Any questions or comments?
We were both struck by the music. I mean, it was astonishing. And I don't know much about movie making, but how does the music happen? Like, would Bernstein have been there right from the beginning, watching all of this and creating the music along the way? Or does he look at the film at the end and create the music?
Ron, first of all, thank you very much for asking that question. I totally would have forgotten about Leonard Bernstein and would have been driving home kicking myself. First of all, by the way, so this is the only movie that Bernstein scored specifically for a film. I certainly scored a lot of musicals that would become movies, but in this case, he was involved at the end. And the movie had been made, and he saw many rushes and started to look at the construct of the film, and he composed it after the fact. It's interesting, if you look at movies leading up to this film, there is a sense of orchestral music and then strains of jazz in it a little bit. I would say atonal classical music to an extent. He was heavily influenced by Aaron Copland as well, who, of course, we all know Bernstein was his own man. But Copland had been one of those individuals that had really made a foray into films, and it was definitely influenced. But I think this score is excellent and exceeds Copland.
So he gets to see the film after and makes the music. How long would that have taken? Like, how long would he have had to make that score?
I really don't know how long he worked on that score, Ron. We were speaking about Patra Panchali for the Satyajit Ray movie the other night, last Sunday night, and like Ravi Shankar did that score in 11 hours. I think that, and recorded it in 11 hours. I want to say Bernstein had a little more time than that, but you often read today that you've got composers that have not seen the finished product yet, the film is coming out in 2 months, and they're having to compose a film and have it scored in a very small period of time. Now, granted, in the case of contemporary composers, as I understand it, they're let in on the entire process as much as they possibly can. They know a script, they understand what the characters are going to be about, so they're let in fairly early on, so they can begin to at least design, but not entirely ready for a finished product. So I apologize, Ron. I don't know the exact amount of time that Bernstein would have known to have or would have had to have composed that. But thanks very much for bringing that up. I mean, I would say that those moments where you see Charlie and of course the scene in the cab, there are these almost leitmotifs for each of these characters that he constructed for them. It's very, very well done. Thanks, Ron. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, how did this film fit in with Marlon Brando's body of work? And I'm curious, in retrospect, if Brando talked about this film and what he thought it represented in his body of work.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Well, first of all, Brando went to see the rushes, saw a draft of the film, and he really hated it. He didn't hate the movie, but he really had a hard time watching himself. Brando wasn't. I was just speaking with Kim earlier and Doug about the fact that Brando didn't like talking about his films. He didn't like reflecting on them. He didn't think it was that important, especially in the later years. And he found that there were far more interesting things to focus on and to pay attention to. But yeah, he had a hard time seeing himself in this role. He thought at times he was very whiny and he wasn't, as masculine as he thought he should be. But that's what I love about his role, is that I think that there's a very, at times, feminine and masculine quality to his movie that, to me, helps anyone be able to relate to him in that capacity. But yeah, he didn't. If you watch a lot of his older interviews, and by older I'm talking 1970s, he was far beyond having any interest in his career at all. When you get into like about the late 70s with Apocalypse Now and Superman, I mean, he's doing some of these movies just to make a bunch of dough, right, to pay for that island. He had everything on cue cards and it's kind of sad. I mean, he's still brilliant. He still has this incredible presence, even in those later films, but he really wasn't committed to doing a lot of the heavy work to find his way in. But he's such an intuitive actor, isn't he? I don't know if that helps answer your question or not, but any other questions? Any comments? Anyone thinking of pursuing a career in longshore work by any chance after seeing this movie? One of the good things that does come out, not of the movie necessarily, but out of the Johnson work that he was doing, was that, when you see the trial in the movie, that's based on a real trial. There was oversight eventually, and people were starting to get full-time work with benefits and health insurance and retirement plans. So there's some good that comes out of speaking up. And, I think making it relevant for today, in the last few years, the empowerment in certain industries to say more, to speak up. I think about the Me Too movement, for instance, where it's the lid was blown off of that with the Weinstein stuff, and then it was from there it never ending, sadly. But it's wonderful that people were able to finally get the word out there. There's a story, I don't know if anyone knows about this, but in which the actress Mira Sorvino, who was, in Mighty Aphrodite, she won the Actress Award for that, and just a brilliant actress, the daughter of Paul Sorvino. Well, she was in the running to be in the Lord of the Rings films directed by Peter Jackson. And Jackson was actually told by the Weinstein people, don't hire her. She's terribly difficult. And of course, it would come out nearly 20 years later. It's because she wanted nothing to do with Weinstein in the Weinstein manner. If I don't have to say any more than that, I hope. But it's to me, the ability to be able to stand up and speak out and say and plead the truth is so imperative. And yet, back to the Waterfront, these guys just accepted it as a way of life, that it was normal, that it's just the way it is, and never questioned it. Of course, at the risk of being harmed or losing their job or themselves being blacklisted. And I guess in the case of B2, it's the same case. Look at Mira Sorvino. I mean, really, there's a period of time you don't see her, sadly, in many things for a long period of time. She was essentially blacklisted. So, and I do know, of course, with speaking up, there is a great deal of responsibility. What is the consequence or the outcome that may happen or occur? And so it is being mindful of that. But also, it does take a tremendous amount of courage to be able to speak up and say what's right. So, all right. Well, I know Fred will be back in December. I believe he's doing Do the Right Thing, the Spike Lee film. And I believe he may have a guest to accompany him for that particular screening. I will be hosting on the 12th of December, Fanny and Alexander, the Ingmar Bergman movie. And of course, we'll have a whole new lineup come up in January that'll soon be out there for everyone. I just want to say a big thank you to all of you for coming out and supporting the Westdale this evening. Wasn't it a kick to see this on a big screen? Just extraordinary. So yes, give it up. A big thank you to all of you. Take care and safe trip home, everyone.